All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this Dome 9 webinar, Better IAM Protection for the Public Cloud. My name is Sudha Srinivasan. I'm the Vice President of Growth and Marketing at Dome 9. I'm here with Patrick Pusher, Technical Evangelist at Dome 9. So the plan for the webinar today, we're going to start by talking about IAM and why IAM management is important in public cloud environments, the role that IAM plays in public cloud security. Then we'll get into some of the common pitfalls and challenges that administrators face when they actually try to set up IAM correctly in large-scale cloud environments. And then we'll get into some of the best practices for IAM management. Patrick, who's a security expert, can get into some of the more detailed practices around IAM management and how administrators can protect their cloud environments. Then we'll look briefly at a tool that Dome 9 provides called Dome 9 IAM Safety that allows you to add an additional layer of protection on top of public cloud security capabilities that are already available. And finally, we'll close with a demo of IAM Safety and some Q&A around what capabilities we offer. So let's jump right in. So what is identity and access management? Identity and access management is that aspect of security that deals with giving individuals in an organization access to different resources at the right time for the right reasons, right? So essentially, figuring out who gets access to what, for what reason, and when is really what identity and access management is all about, right? Now, if you look at IAM, there are some concepts that actually constitute the IAM space. So you talk about users, who are the different people that are going to be accessing resources. Then you talk about the actual resources. You have this other notion called roles, which is essentially a set of permissions to resources that are encapsulated in something called a role. Now, a user can essentially assume a role, or you could have a process or a program that is assuming that role, right? A role allows anyone who has a certain role can go and access resources, right? So users, roles, permissions are common constructs. You also have two concepts, authentication and authorization. Authentication is essentially the gate that tells you which user is entering the system, making sure that the right users are able to log into the system, are able to get into that system. And then authorization is the set of rules that make sure that the right users have access to the right resources, right? Authorization is essentially what allows you to say which user can access what resources and what kind of access they can have to it, okay? So these are some of the common concepts in IAM. Now, if you look at what role IAM plays, before we even get into the role of IAM, we need to look at how public cloud security, AWS security or Azure security, is in many ways different from traditional data center security that many customers are used to, right? So one of the ways in which public cloud environments are different from data center environments is in the definition of the perimeter, right? In a traditional data center environment, you essentially have a trusted perimeter that is guarded by gateway firewalls. So you basically have gateway firewalls that define very strictly what kind of traffic can come within this trusted perimeter and what kind of traffic can go out. And everything within this perimeter or network boundary is trusted, right? That is how you define it in traditional data center infrastructure. But then on the cloud, which is a software-defined environment, essentially this perimeter is defined by a set of security policies in software. What that means is if an administrator accidentally sets a certain security policy or changes a configuration, then you can essentially expose a resource that was intended to be private to a public cloud environment that can now be exposed to the public, right? For example, your database instance may be part of a security group, and if you accidentally go and change a security group configuration, all of a sudden that internal server is now sitting on the public internet and accessible to everyone, right? This essentially makes the network perimeter a lot more fluid in cloud environments. And this is one of the reasons why some of the traditional mechanisms like gateway firewalls or using routers to define traffic flows and so on don't work in the public cloud. So what has happened is if you look at cloud environments, there is a different paradigm for how you actually segment your traffic, right? You have this concept of micro-segmentation or network segmentation based on security groups and policy definitions that dictate what kind of traffic can flow between different security groups and with the external internet, right? And this is how you basically segment your traffic. And this approach is fundamentally different from taking a perimeter-oriented approach. Now, because the perimeter is so fluid, you need a different layer of defense. You need an additional layer of defense when you talk about protecting your cloud resources from malicious users. So Patrick, if you can jump in and talk a little bit about what the collapse of the IT perimeter means for security, that'll be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Sudha. Yeah, I think you alluded to it earlier. Really, I guess when we think about how we did security in the traditional enterprise, we relied on that perimeter defense that you just spoke of, right? That has changed so much as we think about infrastructure as a service, where one small change really nullifies that perimeter. So we've moved from this point where we have a trust boundary kind of around our infrastructure, and at that point, we trust everything on the inside, and on the inside we have very disparate authentication mechanisms and even account databases. We have a separate account database for our storage file, or a separate account database and access controls for our network core, and so on and so forth with all of our infrastructure. That's been replaced. That's gone away and been replaced by a service consumption model where we don't have disparate authentication mechanisms. We have exactly one, and that one mechanism in AWS IAM really dictates access across all of these services, everything you can do with AWS. And so, as you suggested, not just kind of your user database, but then the mappings to both resources and actions in the case of AWS IAM, of all your users. So it's that kind of one vector instead of these different kind of security controls we had inside a trusted border. Now we don't have a trusted border, and we have exactly kind of one way to authenticate and provide access. So it's a very drastic change from what we're used to.
That's very interesting. And if you look at public cloud services like Amazon, they are increasingly starting to provide built-in services, things like AWS Lambda, where you don't even have it's functional programming. You don't have any place to stick agents. Your traditional network security mechanisms don't work because a lot of the access control is done by via API, right? It's not a network call at all. It's over API. And so you need to have some other security mechanism. And in many ways, IAM is becoming that frontier, that perimeter of your security, right?
It is, yeah. Exactly the perimeter. Instead of thinking of the perimeter as kind of the resources out there defending what's inside, think about the one control that really dictates all that access and the keys to the kingdom, so to speak.
Yeah, and can you talk a little bit about what some of the more recent consumption models like DevOps and CI/CD and infrastructure as code? What impact is that having on security and how security is maintained in public cloud environments?
Yeah, and I think in the last little segment you had just called out the role of the API. It's such a good segue into these, like you say, new consumption models where continuous integration, continuous delivery, zero tolerance for downtime means you have a heavily automated environment, and that automation creates some interesting cultural shift, usage pattern shift, and then creates some real breadth that is challenging to understand, to have visibility into, and then to control. That investment in automation that I think big scale enterprise IT makes pays off at higher scale. And when we think about things like cloud first policies we hear within enterprise IT, that's why they make a big investment into understanding, securing the cloud. They want as many workloads that fit kind of that profile to run there, and so you get lots of business units, you get lots of applications, all with unique needs. So this creates really a proliferation of accounts and credentials, and that's across all services. So the breadth of the security model becomes very complicated as well.
Got it. Yeah, and what we're talking about, identity and access management, is not really new to the cloud, right? It's been there in data center environments as well. You've had Active Directory, you've had different ways of authenticating and authorizing users. But what you're saying is, in many ways, cloud environments have a much bigger role for IAM, right? IAM plays a much bigger role in the security in a public cloud environment, even more so than in a traditional data center environment. Is that
Yeah,
right?
yeah, it plays the role. It's the defining factor between identity and the control of all of your resources, and that's the difference. A compromise at a network core could have very disastrous effects, but they don't have access to your data. A compromise with AWS IAM, and you have not only access to data, but backups and archives in Glacier, and everything you do. If you're an AWS centric kind of presence, which many customers are and many companies are, it truly is kind of the one authentication mechanism, the one credential to rule them all.
Got it. So now when we talk about that one credential and IAM playing such a central role, right? It's a very powerful security measure in cloud environments. It also becomes a new attack vector for many people, right? Because if you can somehow get past IAM controls, then you have the keys to the kingdom. And so, this is an area where we are starting to see more and more attacks come through because now the IAM is an interesting place for someone to come and try to breach cloud. Can you talk a little bit about some of these new attack vectors?
Sure. Yeah, and the proliferation of the different attack vectors is just for that very reason, right? The power inherent in this one master control is just it's too tempting for those with malicious intent. So we do find that, and we find the code spaces kinds of stories where there was some sort of compromise at the ID level, at the access permission level, and that's it. So it's not surprising that we see varying kinds of attacks, varying kinds of compromises, all targeted at IAM, and we see things like keyloggers kind of installed, obviously, on the without users understanding and detection, kind of data collecting silently as you go. There's defense against some of these things, but when you think about them holistically, man in the browser type compromises, a practice that used to be a lot worse than it is, but that we still see, embedding credentials in scripts, that leverage the API, things like this that we know better by now. Yet we're sort of we're used to our old ways, and if we take those old ways to how we do things at AWS, again, with this kind of one control to rule them all, then there's too much power in that control to be sloppy.
Got it. Yep. And this is definitely an area that I think administrators need to pay close attention to how they're going to secure it and the different mechanisms they have available to them, right? So let's start talking about some of the best practices. Now, broadly speaking, when you talk about best practices for security, you have preventive measures that allow you to basically prevent an attack from happening, right? And with IAM, you have a set of preventive measures. And then you have detection and containment, right? So if a breach happens or if you have compromised credentials, then how do you ensure that the damage caused by that breach is minimized, right? So can you talk about both these? Start with preventive measures. What are some of the things that administrators can do to ensure that they're minimizing the number of attacks?
Sure. Yeah, and as you suggested earlier, this is not new. What's new is that the stakes are so much higher that we get all this right and that we're diligent. We can't make a mistake anywhere, again, due to this single sort of point of focus. So yeah, we think about things that again aren't new concepts, but we take the accounts that come sort of built in with the platform, our root accounts that are privileged by design, and we make sure we don't use those. We leverage other accounts where we tie specific permissions to them. There's just an amount of control, amount of power inherent in that root account that don't send those credentials over the public internet unless you have to. So we take those accounts, we don't use them, we don't leverage them like we do custom accounts. When we do assign permissions, we do that the best we can from a group perspective. So we're not doing ad hoc permissions, and what an auditing nightmare that becomes at the end of the year as you try to reel in access controls. Password policies, again, not just password. We see a bullet at the end of this list around MFA as well, but that doesn't kind of let us off the hook for password. Make sure that password length is the defining factor around your policy. It's good to have non-dictionary words and everything else as part of your policy, but the one single factor, if you had to choose one, is always password length. Removing unused security credentials. I mean, other than simply not being sloppy, obviously this is used to mitigate that possibility where you've got an ex-employee or someone who used to have access, or a process that used to have access and still does because we haven't been diligent enough in our assessment of what needs to be cleaned up. So all those things are pretty well established practices. The differences here, of course, again, they become much more important. So, we used to have a security model where we would build an account, we would tie rights to that account, and then we'd share those credentials with third parties, for example, or to put those credentials in scripted automation efforts. And we know now, that process is sort of deprecated. We don't do that as much now. We build policies at AWS. We tie that to roles, and then we can do things like sharing a role for cross-account access for service providers, for example. And that way, you're much more in the driver's seat in terms of exactly what that role and policy can do. And that's the newer integration method. And look for that method rather than the older, less secure one.
Got it. And a lot of these things that you're talking about here, like multi-factor authentication or IAM roles and so on, is provided by the underlying cloud service provider. Amazon has come a long way in providing security measures to ensure that you are using it the right way. But it is up to the customer or the admin to use the tools that Amazon provides to basically configure their IAM effectively, right? And,
That's right.
And the thing that you talked about in terms of removing unused security credentials, it's just keeping things clean on the IAM side. So let's talk about detection and containment, right? So now someone manages to get in. How do you contain or how do you kind of contain the blast radius, essentially?
Right. Yeah. Obviously detecting the issue, it's absolutely key. Needing kind of that real-time visibility into situational security awareness and status. Without it, you're really kind of flying blind, right, in terms of having a chance at a timely resolution. So, as you suggest, AWS has some really core capabilities that you'll want to leverage: CloudTrail logs, CloudWatch events. That with CloudWatch events, you can leverage not only all the kind of built-in auditability that AWS can do against services, but then you can tie in your application logging and notifications into the same stream. So you get kind of one data feed into your SIM tool set, for example, that's got your infrastructure and application sort of security measures and control output in it. So that's very, very powerful. And having that kind of holistic data feed, I think, is really advantageous when you're thinking about, especially these scenarios we talked about, this continuous integration, continuous delivery. So detection is really important. And then, kind of working down the list here, again, not new, trying to contain, making that responsible assumption that, no security control, especially a public one, is infallible. If somebody does get in, if there's a breach, if there's credential theft, then what happens? To your point, how do we contain the kind of damage that can be done? We can do that by ensuring this, privilege or principle of least privilege, making sure that we are ensuring that our accounts and the role-based administration, if we're following the best practice of the last slide, we're doing so at a minimal level and not taking the easy path and saying, I'm going to assign these rights because someday you'll need them. Being very diligent about exactly the rights we assign is important, and that will, of course, contain, if there's a credential theft, that'll contain some sort of damage. But there's always that core set of trusted sysadmin type of roles or users that are going to have to do sensitive things. So it's always it's a bit of a straddling line between usability, making sure your users can do what they need to do through the course of any given day, but then also enough visibility and security on top of that to to have confidence that they're not breaking rules. So I think that kind of speaks to most of this list. The last point has to do more with the segregation that we all know is a best practice between our accounts, right? Doing so, if you're separating your dev, test, even sort of project-based initiatives by AWS account, then what we suggested earlier, this kind of keys to the kingdom, so to speak, you have to get multiple keys to sort of get all of your infrastructure. We're doing the segregation to ensure that we don't have one single account that rules everything, all of our efforts at AWS. And while that's a best practice, we do see, especially infrastructure teams of sort of limited resource say that I want to do that, but then securely and consistently managing across those 2, 3, 4. I mean, the largest domain customers have hundreds of accounts. Being able to manage across those consistently becomes a real challenge.
That is a great point, right? I mean, one of the ways in which you can have effective security is by creating these silos, right? Segregating different access, but then that also creates a problem of scale because now you have tens of accounts or dozens of accounts, and you have to manage security across them, right? And you have to kind of do it consistently. You have to do it at scale. And so this is an area that you have to trade off what you can do. You've had to trade off in the past security for ability to manage at scale. And this is really where an area where if you had the right tools in order to get visibility across different accounts, you could actually manage this more consistently. So now let's talk about we talked about prevention best practices, we talked about detection and containment best practices. So where does IAM safety fit into all this, right? You already have these rules that admins should follow. These are well-established principles, both in traditional data center environments as well as on the cloud. So what is the need for another tool for security in IAM? Can you paint the scenario? Can you paint the picture?
Sure, yeah, and I teased a little bit in our last discussion on the current slide, but you can follow those principles of least privileges as far as you can, and it's definitely a best practice to do so. But again, when you've got these sensitive actions, the most powerful things that IAM affords us, the things that you will need to do from time to time, building a database, tearing a database down, deleting storage buckets. It's this kind of capability that requires a very trusted user, a high level of privilege, and is something that does need to be done. So how do you protect credentials that have those kinds of rights? Again, from malicious attempt, from takeover, from credential theft, from man in the browser kinds of compromises. It's this condition where we've got some very, very trusted, capable individuals, but of course all that's between them and the power in what their account represents in terms of rights is a set of credentials, and that's the use case that IAM Safety really considers. Sudhi, if you're speaking, we can't hear you.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. So let's switch to a demo now. I think this is a good time to kind of showcase the product, and then we can get back to talking about benefits and where you would want it.
Sounds great. Let me share out my screen. Okay, welcome to your Don't dashboard. For Don't users, this will be familiar. For new users, welcome. A lot of the tiles you see here have to do with, oh, I am going to, looks like my screen went away, just one sec. Okay, here it comes. So today we're not going to focus on the network security portions of Dome 9. You can see kind of a lot of the tiles, a lot of the kinds of resources you can manage. We are looking specifically at IAM safety. And really the process starts with you considering those actions afforded to us by AWS IAM that you consider potentially dangerous, certainly if in the wrong hands. I used an example just now around deleting an S3 storage bucket. You can imagine that if somehow I was able to steal your credentials and log into the AWS console, that my ability to delete an S3 storage bucket would have a pretty significant impact on your applications running on AWS. I think that's a fair assumption. So this is a very popular one, but think about all the services you consume at AWS and work through this effectively kind of menu of capability from IAM. And I did a service kind of level filter, but you can also do operational filters. A really nice shortcut if you're looking for, delete operations tend to be rather catastrophic and often final, so they're a good place to focus on. But again, what you're building is really considered the IAM safety restricted policy, and this is step one of the process. So go through and do that. The next step then, you will have a full category here, or sorry, catalog here of IAM users and IAM roles. And what you're going to do now is decide either kind of individually or with that protect all button on the far right hand side, we're going to take the abilities we put in that restricted policy away from our users. And if I hit that protect all button, it'll take it away from everybody. And I can do that for users and roles. So that's, that's sort of step two. The next step then is to consider for which users and for which roles you want to pare back that ability to gain access to these things in the restricted policy. For those trusted users that from time to time, following our last example, from time to time we'll have to delete that S3 storage bucket as part of an approved kind of activity. They're going to elevate their rights for a short period of time. using a necessarily out-of-band application, at least from a workstation perspective. It's available on iOS and Android. And they're going to elevate their rights for a short period of time, do those sensitive actions contained in your restricted policy, and then when they're done, fall back to that state of privilege that is every day. And the intention here is that, if there is a compromise event, and if somebody is able to log in as that user who isn't that user, they will be restricted to not being able to do those biggest, most impactful operations afforded to us by IAM. They won't have the means to do that rights elevation that is required to gain access to the most sensitive services. So rather than talk more in theory, let's have a look in practice sort of what this looks like. If we go to the AWS console, and for this example, I'll be a DNS administrator, so I'll have some work to do in Route 53. And when I go there, you'll see that I really don't have privilege to do anything. I've got errors across the screen, and that's because my administrator put everything to do with Route 53 in that DOM 9 IAM safety restricted template, or restricted policy rather. So now, thankfully, they've also paired me up with the application. So now what I can do is I can take out my Android or iPhone device, click the IAM safety application, and elevate my rights. And that process looks like this. This is my Android emulator, and this is my IAM safety application. And so I'm going to go ahead and click this button. And you'll see that now I've got 15 minutes of this elevated privilege to do the work I have to do, these sensitive operations as deemed by my administrators. I can go back to the console, click reload, and you'll see that now I have the rights to do what I need to do. Again, only for that time-limited window. And if I'm a security-conscious employee, I'll come back, of course, and I'll actively stop this. And when I do that, now my rights are falling back to that established state, that non-elevated state, to be able to continue to work day to day. I can do a lot of the things I need to do at the console, but I just can't do these most sensitive operations. One of the things sort of about this model, sometimes that people who see it the first time don't understand, is that this is not an additional rights model that competes with the policy you build at AWS. This is complementary to that. So by elevating my rights through DOM 9 IAM safety, I'm not getting access to capability that I don't have already as part of my native or organic policies at AWS. I have to contain that ability first, but if I do, by restricting me with the restricted policy, I'm taking those rights away and making the path to obtain them via the IAM safety application. So now that I've actively stopped, I come back, I click reload, and you will see that the console again looks at that state, and sometimes it just takes a second to do so. But the console now looks like the state it did as I entered the feature, right? Because my rights are back at that less privileged state where, heaven forbid, if there's a compromise event, that party won't be able to, exercise the most dangerous controls within AWS.
Excellent. Thanks, Patrick. So we talked about a number of different things that IAM safety does, right? We talked about how using IAM safety, you get, at a glance, all the different IAM users and roles that you have in the system and the kinds of permissions that they have. You have the ability to go and strip certain access to certain critical actions from all the accounts. Essentially, you can create a firewall for IAM permissions in your cloud environment, right? So this is kind of a firewall for the IAM. And then you can also look at what kind of access you have for different actions within your environment, right? That's what you're looking at right now. Like, what kinds of access do you have for different resources, security groups, and so on, right?
Yeah, that's right. I love that term, sort of firewall for IAM. If we're thinking about IAM as the new perimeter, like we talked about earlier, then certainly we need a firewall. We need something out in front of IAM that, again, allows us to really take this concept of least privilege and just extend it way further and say, look, day to day, you do not need the level of privilege that you do on an exception basis. And because you don't, let's make sure you operate at that level day to day, so that, if there is it is sort of a credential theft event or a man in the browser kind of compromise or a keylogger, any of the types of compromises we talked about earlier, they're not getting the most power that they can.
Right, and you're talking about actions, like when you talk about restricting actions, you're talking about things like changing DNS entries or going and deleting one of your central databases, right? So these
That's
are
right.
things that no one should be able to do on a day in day out basis. It's one of those rare things that you do. It's a critical action. It can have a catastrophic effect if you go and screw things up. And so even for an admin, it's not something that you want them accidentally doing. It's not something that if someone were to get access to an admin account, like a VP of engineering account, you don't want them going and making these changes without that just-in-time authorization. So this is an important distinction. You talk about IAM safety as just-in-time authorization or multi-factor authorization as opposed to authentication, right? Can you just talk a little bit about that more?
Yeah, that's right. Multi-factor authorization rather than authentication. The first level of authorization becomes again, your native policies already established at AWS wrapped around IAM. What users can do what actions, and consume what resources. That's your first level of authorization. And then Dome 9 comes along and adds a second level where only for, again, we don't want to put a barrier between users and productivity. We do want to put a barrier between users and very sensitive very sensitive operations. That barrier is very lightweight, very easy to either have in the hands of an end user or to even have kind of in an approval work chain, right? We went through the example of saying, as a user, I can self-serve this ability, but we have examples of usage around IAM safety where that authentication mechanism is done at a management or a team lead level where accountability kind of ends. So the approach can fit a number of sort of workflow processes within your organization, but absolutely.
Excellent. And that is exactly the key thing. You're trying to balance kind of usability and making it seamless, frictionless, so that the right user has access to all the actions they need with like all the permissions they need. So you're not trying to put barriers up, but you're still trying to provide that pseudo for the cloud. Right? You're trying to provide that just-in-time elevation or authorization that is required to go and take these critical actions. So it's essentially like a safety switch for the cloud for specific actions.
It is, and that sudo or su for the cloud. That's a good kind of analogy to make. I think a lot of the sysadmin kind of developer types will understand. We're protecting us against ourselves. We never talked about that use case, but it's certainly there. When we're cruising along and we're making assumptions and we're doing things in haste, IAM safety says, just wait a minute. There's another process to follow. And one of the things I really like about it is that becomes an audited event in Dome 9. So now every time someone requests access, no matter how you're using the feature, you're going to get a timestamp and a username sort of information feed from Dome 9 saying, this user at this time elevated their rights with IAM safety. So now you're in the know around when this happens.
Got it. That is exactly what you need. You need that audit trail so that you know who's accessing what, complete visibility into your IAM side of your cloud security, basically. So let's quickly kind of summarize. I'm going to take the ball back and okay, in closing, we talk about what IAM safety is. IAM safety is essentially privilege elevation on an as-needed basis. So for certain protected actions, critical actions like going and changing DNS entries or going and deleting some files that you're not supposed to, essentially IAM safety is that last line of defense for your IAM perimeter. Right? The way it works is, if you're a malicious user, if you've stolen credentials and so on, you have the password to the account. You have some way of authenticating yourself as a valid privileged user, right? As the VP of engineering or the CEO of a company. But once you actually try to access any resources which are protected by IAM, you essentially hit this error message, right? You're not able to even access the DNS entries, let alone modify them. Now, if you are, on the other hand, a legit user, then you hit this error message, then you can use your out-of-band mobile device and the Dome 9 application to give yourself access for a certain limited amount of time, right? Even there, it's not just keeping it open or giving the admin access all the time. It is for a limited window, right? 15 minutes, during which you have access to those actions, right? You can go and look at your DNS entries, modify them, set anything you need, and then you're coming back out, right? And we have audited tamper protection. So when IAM is that final gate, that last kind of line of defense, you do not want unauthorized changes to your IAM policies itself, right? So first of all, there is tamper protection on the IAM side, and any unauthorized changes are detected and they are logged in the audit mechanism. And then you also have this, whenever someone is hitting this stage, this error message, that again is logged. So you basically have a complete log and a trail of all suspicious activity, right? And second level out-of-band authorization, which is a just-in-time mechanism, actually provides an additional layer of defense on top of your multi-factor authentication and the roles and permissions and other best practices that you have in place, right? So this is another line of defense, right? And it's important to know that, you can, one way of consuming this is to give yourself that additional second level authorization. You can also define, in larger organizations where you might have approval processes or workflows where you have two people involved in the approval chain, where you could have a VP of engineering, and when they want to push something, you have to have the CEO basically approve it. You can define those workflows as well using IAM safety, right? So second level out-of-band authorization and very granular control. It's not like a broad sweeping, permission on, permission off. Right. You are able to define which specific security groups, what specific actions you want to give access or restrict access to.
Yeah, that's right. And one of the things that makes sense to mention probably, the demo example, we did kind of a one-to-one account, but if you look at the iPhone device on this slide, you can see there's actually two accounts configured. And the risk profile, not only is it granular, you can build an IAM safety kind of restricted policy per account, and each account can have a very different risk profile. Your production account, you could put much more capability under IAM safety to keep it locked down and again keep it very auditable in terms of who's using what resources and what rights, versus your staging account, which might be right below it, where you're auditing the very most sensitive things, but the level of data sensitivity is much different, so your control is much less. You have that flexibility with IAM safety.
That's right, and an administrator has complete control over what kinds of actions they want to restrict and control using IAM safety, right? So if I am a privileged user, I may be part of your continuous deployment or continuous delivery chain. I don't want my day-to-day operations to be restricted or hampered in any way, right? Anything that takes agility away from my day-to-day is something that I'm going to resist. So IAM safety allows you to be very granular about the kinds of actions that you want to restrict. Right? You don't have to go and blanket restrict everything. You can say things like this, like things that you typically expect to be done once or maybe twice in the life of a cloud application. Those actions you can restrict so that you don't get into scenarios where essentially a hacker is coming and has control of your cloud environment, is taking you hostage and basically demanding ransom. And this is something that, one of the cases that we've heard a lot about in the past is a story of cloud code spaces, right? And the fact that their account was essentially hacked and all their databases were encrypted, and the hacker basically said, pay up or I'm going to start deleting, and they basically lost their entire business. The entire business went down, went bankrupt in a fraction of the time that it would take normally, right? That's because once you have access to a cloud environment, you have the keys to the kingdom. If you have a privileged user account, right now you have complete access to everything, right? And this is something that keeps a lot of CEOs up at night, right? Including our own CEOs, Zohar alone, because as Dome9 is a SaaS application, we run on the cloud, so we want to make sure that we are protected, even if a privileged user, like a VP of engineering or someone who's part of the deployment chain, their account gets compromised. We don't want the entire cloud environment to be held in ransom, right? That is one of the scenarios that Dome9 IAM safety protects against.
Yeah, that's right. So, it's not about scare tactics or stories. It's about a call to action around being diligent. We talked about our best practices. They're as important as ever, and so too is IAM safety in terms of being able to do that least privilege model. That's
right. So in quick summary, we talked about best practices. We talked about why IAM is important in public cloud environments. It's even more so important than traditional data center environments, because IAM in many ways is that final frontier of security in the cloud, right? When your network perimeter is very fluid, your last line of defense is the kind of access that you provide to different users and roles to resources in your cloud environment. And that is really where sound kind of best practice IAM management is important. And we talked about preventive measures as well as containment and detection measures, right, to figure out how you can prevent users from getting access, unauthorized users, and when they are in, how do you make sure that they don't have complete access to everything? And Dome9 IAM Safety provides ways to both prevent attacks as well as to contain attacks when they happen, right? So this is a very quick walkthrough of the Dome9 IAM Safety capabilities as well as best practices. If you have any questions, please do drop us a note. My email is sudha@dome9.com. Patrick's is patrick@dome9.com. We look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you.